We are joined today by the Department of Education, several representatives here. We thank you all for coming in. The Department of Education Commissioner, Betty Rosa, thanks so much for coming on with us today. We have Jeffrey Madison, the Senior Deputy Commissioner, and the Assistant Commissioner, David Frank. Thank you all for sitting down and having this discussion. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I want to start with a concept here that I think can help guide this conversation with the three of you. And it's something the governor said at her budget presentation. And this was when she was discussing, obviously, education, such a big part of the budget itself, as we know. And there was one quote she had that really stuck out to me. It said, "Funding doesn't guarantee outcomes." And I think that is something that is sort of an underlying theme, a conversation that's had in a lot of places in New York State when it comes to education. When you hear that, Commissioner, what does that mean to you?
Right, but despite the fact that she made that comment, she has really, when you think about it, committed to funding in ways that I think support the whole issue of equity, access, and opportunity. So we listen to it from the perspective that while it doesn't guarantee, it is critical to supporting student success. So we clearly want to make sure that the funding is targeted, that we are intentional with what the kind of work we have to do in the various spaces for all students. And our board is our Board of Regents is very much committed to creating the all means all students. So the outcomes that we are looking at is beyond just test scores. Our outcomes are creating students that are critical thinkers, problem solvers, have a way of thinking about career awareness, and getting them ready for college and career, and making sure that all the work that we do and all the funding really gets behind the kinds of outcomes that we have also great citizens and civic-minded young people.
What are the other factors then that help those outcomes and help create those at the end of the day? If funding's one piece.
Correct. I think it's looking at the funding and, as I stated, being very intentional and targeted, right? So that we know that we have districts, for example, we have rural districts where we have to make sure that the high quality education for those students in terms of the teaching and the learning is provided, despite that they may have fewer students in those classrooms, or in cases where the budget is such that it's very hard to create multiple ways of addressing the kinds of preparation that they need. So those are key issues that we consider as we're looking at what are the creative ways, how do we innovate, how do we use the technology, how do we use the resources to ensure that all children in this state receive a high quality education.
Obviously we've had this conversation of how the funding works, and you just alluded to the governor fully funding Foundation A for the first time ever. It took a little longer than I think people would have liked, but the governor in her tenure was able to do that. But how that is allocated, I think, has been the big question here. And the formula itself, does the state, because we saw the research from the Rockefeller Institute, and we saw a couple of those recommendations implemented, does the state need to be more aggressive in implementing more of them here and now, and not waiting?
Well, I think that one of the things that I'm sure most people know is that we obviously were interested in being, and we were involved to some extent in the what I would call looking at the formula and doing some tweaking, but we need a new formula, and we need models, and we need to look at the formula and look at the the subgroups, and look at the students who are homeless, look at the different opportunities that we need to create, and have a formula that addresses that. English language learners, students with special needs. So in some ways, we are still committed to research and creating a new formula. Our department really wants to be intimately involved with finding a pathway to creating a new formula. Jeff?
Yeah, well, we also are concerned about foster kids, homeless kids, and we've seen some of the message from the Board of Regents to want to target some money toward those students come through with proposals in the One House budgets as well. And I think the other thing that a new strategy in the past 2 or 3 budgets has been to target some particular educational issues that we think are important, like the science of reading piece, focusing on that. And that's the thing where some of it is just everybody rowing in the same direction, getting the state focused on something. Dual enrollment, the following year we did a big dual enrollment push. This year there's a mathematics push. So targeting the funds to address particular educational issues, I think, is really important. So the formula gives you your baseline to run the enterprise, because it's incredibly expensive to pull all the students in the community together with the busing, with the schools, with our guidelines on safety to make sure they're secure while they're there, to make sure we have the personnel for the students. But then once you get that baseline in place, how are we going to target those funds to maximize student outcomes?
I did want to get a bit deeper on the weighting of the formula, because I think that'd be good for people to understand. You mentioned some of these groups of kids that's important to target, and then that translates, right, whatever they're weighted as translates into funding.
Correct.
How can you explain a little bit more about how that works and why that matters here?
So I'll start it, and then first of all, like any formula, you have a base, right? But then you also know that in order to be intentional and create the target and the kinds of resources that students need, especially when you think about language acquisition, that is going to take additional funding to find bilingual teachers or multilingual teachers, and also different materials that are geared towards ensuring that the students are acquiring the language. Same thing with special education, right? You're going to need additional funding to support the development or responsiveness to the special needs, particularly with students with their IEPs, and the additional staffing that goes with that. Homelessness is another type of issue. So these are very, sometimes we refer to them as subgroups within the group that need intervention, and in some cases need a great deal of pre-work and a great deal of resources to support their acquisition of their teaching and learning. And their learning is the core for all of us. So in order to do that, you have to have a formula that reflects and support the needs of these individual groups.
Yeah, and the formula, we hope, drives money to the highest need of those students. And that's why it's important the data we collect has to be really good data, so we know if there's English language learners, if we know there's homeless students, we know who their special ed students are. The second part of that is we have partners in the funding too, and the federal government gives some money through McKinney-Vento for homeless students, but it's insufficient for the kind of need, which is why the Board of Regents has wanted to emphasize that a little bit more to support districts to meet the needs of those students. But also IDEA, the promise of that and the funding there has never been realized by the federal government. And what happens as a consequence is, CSE, which is the committee that determines the kind of services a student receives, they follow legal guidelines and they have to provide the services to the student. And if the state is paying its portion and the locals are paying their portion and the state or the federal government is paying half of their portion, someone's got to make up the difference. And it falls on the local taxpayer, or even the state at times will try to make up the difference. If you're spending more of your local or state money to make up for that hole, guess what you're not spending it on? Some of those other targeted groups. So there is a challenge there in that promise has never been realized by the federal government.
From the state standpoint, should there be more urgency here? I mean, obviously you're saying, and we've heard the unions say that as well, we need to make these changes now. You hear some lawmakers in the Capitol say, well, New York spends more per pupil than anyone else in the state, yet we're not leading the country in education. what's missing, in terms of getting this done, in terms of political will and motivation?
Well, I think sometimes when people make that statement, they're basing it on one particular moment, one particular indicator, right? You're not looking at, for example, as we went through COVID. New York was hammered versus, other states. We also have a large population. I mean, the number of languages, New York City alone, like 58 languages, where we're trying to educate students and making sure that they make the transition and are still maintaining the language, home language, at the same time acquiring English. Special education. The larger your groups, the more expensive it's going to be, and the more complex the students' needs are. You have, a response to those, and that's an added expense. So while we are really committed to ensuring that all children receive the kind of quality education that they need, and our assessments for the most part, when you look at our state with all of its complexity, we are an expensive state to live. It isn't as if, home-wise and salaries and really the investment of having individuals who go into this profession. This is very challenging when you have the kinds of salary. So while, we would love to have the home or the taxes that other places have, we have to look at the complexity and the totality of all the issues that we grapple with urban centers, rural, urban, suburban. And, the other thing I want to say is that, this governor has even gone as far as looking at the early child care from 0 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 8, in order to build that foundation, to really, truly create an early start in making sure that our children are prepared, so that by the time they walk into that, as 4-year-olds, they walk into that kindergarten class, pre-K, that there's a readiness. So there has been an incredible investment in making sure that early start is happening, and that's to her credit.
Obviously that's a big part of the whole universal pre-K, childcare, big part of this year's budget conversation. It looks like, obviously right here we're pending the finalization, but it looks like a big chunk of that's getting through. That's one of the less controversial. But how do you facilitate that? I know we've heard questions about workforce. We've heard questions about facilities to be able to do this, the infrastructure. How do you get that done?
Well, first of all, you get it done by first having a belief system, a mission, and a vision, and then really looking at the whole universal pre-K. I mean, that's been the board, the department and the board, as well as this governor, really looking at this in a way that looks for what's the plan, what's the solution, and what's the destination. How do we get there? And our team has been working with cross-agency work with OCFS, and really looking at what are the barriers, what are the ways that we can remove those barriers in order to ensure that this is a dream, this is a hope, and this is possible. And so a lot of that work in analyzing the data and the barriers, and then having solutions to these barriers has been key. Building aid is a way of really expanding on those places that need the space in the room. We also know that we have to have trained, and a standardization of what's expected across the board. But we do need, to your point, we do need to start thinking about parity and staffing, and the complexity of the work needs to take us to a place where we're all working together and pulling in the same direction.
How do you do that with workforce when you look at some of these proposals, the governor, the assembly didn't have any increases in pay for workforce. And then you do have the Senate. They had that fund that we've discussed before with lawmakers, $500,000 to have sort of a more permanent, ability to be able to give these workers competitive pay, right? A life pay. I mean, but like I said, the 2/3 didn't really look to address that.
I think this proposal that the executive put forward this year takes care of that low reimbursement for UPK that was part of the roadblock for people expanding. So they should be able to level up the salaries, at least those who are working in universal pre-K settings. It doesn't necessarily take care of your child care setting issue. That's going to remain. But it's helpful as far as attracting a workforce. But there's a couple other issues too, and you kind of alluded to one with facilities, but there is building aid available for that, but doesn't mean schools have the space to add on, et cetera. And the second is transportation, and one of the things that's missing is they do need to make transportation aid available for transporting UPK students. We can't just make it so any parent who wants to go to universal pre-K can have their student go there and then not have transportation services to get them there. So we're hopeful that they'll include that in the end deal. But the other issue that we've heard from districts when we did our regionalization studies is they would like to do a lot more sharing across district lines of UPK, et cetera, and do a more regionalization approach. And right now, those monies can't necessarily flow that way. So we're going to have to think over these next couple of years of the phase-in. Fortunately, there is a phase-in. It's not an immediate mandate. About what other tweaks would there need to be so that we can really maximize and get to, I think the target is to get 85% of the students, because parents make other choices for their students at that age as well, because it's not compulsory. It's mandated for the districts to offer, but not compulsory for parents to make sure their students are in those programs. So, this is a great place to start. It's a exciting time to see that we're that close to universal, and hopefully get this one across the finish line and then take a look at what we have left, and we'll continue to advocate for those final tweaks.
To help facilitate that, I know that's been thrown out there, this Office of Child Care and Early Education. What's your role in that?
Well, we just actually, the governor put together a group that we are having conversations about, again, going back to the 0 to 3, 3 to 5, and moving it into obviously UPK and kindergarten. And so, and looking at it all the way to 8-year-olds. So the conversations are really sharing ideas and thoughts. And I was actually asked to, although we're an independent agency, the governor did include us in the visits and the 3 counties that are doing the pilot. But we have been pretty much at the table in many of the conversations with the other agencies in this space, because I think she realizes that in order to create a continuum of learning for all children, and starting with the brain research and all the work that we know is key, that various agencies have to be at the table, including mental health issues, including really creating awareness around the importance of early start. And she has commissioned the fact that let's start the conversation about ways that we can all work together. And as Jeff talked about regionalization, how do we share our toys? How do we share our resources? How do we maximize by sharing the resources so that we can not only come up with ideas of how to come up with solutions, but also the ways that we can think together to drive this issue and this continuum.
I mean, obviously, it makes a big impact on the child, but also there's an economic multiplier that we've been talking about there, and that's why there's been some of this will to be able to implement this. I do want to get back to our theme of the outcomes,
Sure.
because we talked a lot about the funding of those mechanisms as well. But what about the methodology and when it comes to teaching? As we've seen some initiatives over the last few years, the Back to Basics. How has that transition going from looking at reading, structured literacy to balanced literacy from your purview?
So sure. So we have been, as you know, from the very, very beginning, we have been working with our school districts. And while, we obviously, you always hear the term local control, but even with local control, we have been able to create briefs, create webinars, create opportunities where our BOCES have really created, what I would call spaces and places where we can all engage with the Big Five and everybody to think about what are the strategies and what are the methods and strategies and resources that we need to use that reflect the latest research, and that these practices are put in place to support all children. Multiple ways of really responding to children's needs. And we've had even conversations about developing educational plans for every child, not just an IEP for special needs students. In our very exciting Portrait of the Graduate, as well as New York Inspires, the whole issue of the science of reading is very much a part of delivery, creating a delivery system that we use research, and we look at the kind of research that's going to create the kind of outcomes. We look at data. We constantly are examining districts. As you know, we have monitors in districts that obviously are struggling. And we have a whole team of individuals that are committed to this work to ensure that our instructional strategies from the state perspectives are reflected in our local districts. And so while we do not, as you know, we often talk about the fact that we don't really direct districts in terms of their selection of curricula. We're getting a little bit much more, I would say, engage in assuring that the selections, we just did a survey, which I know Jeff is going to talk about quickly, making sure that the science of reading is being used and that districts are using resources and using strategies that are research-based and that are going to give us the kinds of outcomes that we need.
Yeah, so part of the requirement of the law that was passed 2 years ago was for districts to self-report, what they were using, what kind of alignment they had curriculum-wise with the science of reading. We've got all that data, we've been analyzing it, and now our literacy associates are putting together a plan to now reinforce those that are fully on board and support those that they're struggling with finding the right materials, they're struggling with teacher training, et cetera, because this isn't going to happen like in a brief moment. It'll take a couple of years, it'll take some time. And fortunately, we know, within 2 years, we'll see students that have had multiple years of this really good core instruction. We'll start to see some of that appear, I would hope, in the performance data. So it's going to take a little time, but we also have seen higher education institutions turning some of their courses to be more directed toward the science of reading, and we've had great conversations with them. So the whole system is getting in alignment, and that's what needs to happen. And fortunately, the governor took leadership 2 years ago. The whole state is on board, and we're not all the way there, right? Because people need support to get there. We have a lot of districts that are under-resourced. It would need some support to make sure their teachers are well prepared to be able to do this.
How much of it has been rolled out? How many teachers have been trained in this at this point?
It's hard to tell because the only numbers we have are the ones for the New York State United Teachers Training. But we have several micro-credentials around the state being offered that many teachers and principals and superintendents have been part of. There's one that's been heavily used down at New Paltz, so we don't have those numbers of how many. We also don't know about the internal trainings that school districts have done on their conference days. We can get information from our BOCES when they're having regional training. So, we can't tell exactly how many. We just know it's really ramping up now, that it's a pretty consistent thing that's happening. And we have a lot of faith that the turnaround is going to get all the way there. that we can support it and celebrate this with student outcomes pretty soon.
Yeah, because I did want to give you an opportunity to respond. You probably saw in the newspaper this week, the Times Union said there were some educational experts that were looking at how the training was being done and said that some of it was confusing, some of the old ways were being combined with some of the new ways. Is that intentional, or is that something that you're looking to address at this point?
So we've had an internal conversation about this because we did see the same article. I did speak to Melinda as well. This, as you know, this money was targeted, and the union prepared the course. We just basically are overseeing the contract itself. We do not choose the curricula, although we're in conversations to making sure that there is a response to why these so-called experts that obviously contributed to the article, making sure that, we hadn't even seen the slides. So making sure that in fact that the science of reading is exactly what the teachers are receiving. So we are going to continue the conversations with them as they take stock and take a look at the delivery system that they're using. Now from our end, because that's just one specific delivery, targeted delivery system, that money that the union received. What I can say is that from our end, in terms of the department, we have been fully committed to the science of reading with our commission, our experts that worked on our dyslexia task force. We continue to have Path Forward, which is very much with the Hunts Institute, and we're very much having those meetings constantly. And so our department, as a department, has been 100% committed to the science of reading with the strategies that are very strongly aligned. Now, in addition to that, we've also worked with higher ed. So we're having those conversations with New Paltz and other colleges, and even SUNY and CUNY. And we continue to also use our external experts because we do have partners in other organizations, whether it's CCSSO, which is connected to the work that we're doing, as well as other other support systems. We were selected as one of 8 states, 4 blue and 4 red, to do this work around literacy and math, and we are really trying to advance and bring forth a much larger scope of this work than this one specific course that was in this article. We are very much committed to the landscape of the science of reading and the science of numeracy and math, but we're doing it with experts. I mean, we lean on, Dr. Lasso at Harvard University. She looked at our standards work, and she's also done a lot of our great work in early childhood, as well as we continue to do our briefs with experts, and those are available. So I know that while this focus was on one, the union's course, I would hope that the public realizes that what I consider the landscape of the department is so much larger and broader, and our work is really based on the research.
Staying in the classroom here before we get a little bit broader to the America 250. Yeah. I know that's why David's here
right.
to talk a lot about that. But I did want to ask about cell phones and how that's going. We know the governor a month or so ago and said, look at this. Kids are going back and paying attention in class, talking to each other again. It's interesting, and I try not to read the comments in case anyone's wondering,
right.
But we do get comments on some of these things where people are saying, I'm wondering what you're hearing from districts, in terms of this implementation. And I know that you've been big on local control and how they adjudicate this, but some are, they have dummy phones or it's not being enforced. Do you hear any of that from districts, or is there any those challenges there at this point?
Yeah, we do a great deal of visits to school,
Yeah.
and our inspections are really to see the culture of our classrooms and to see that the work that we're doing is is it really landing, or can we see evidence base in those classrooms? So the one thing I would tell you, so going back very quickly to the Science of Reading, we do see tremendous evidence, when we do visit our schools, and we go from North Country to, I was in Great Neck, David and I were in Great Neck last week, to be exact, at the high school. But we did also have the elementary school kids come over. So we do look for evidence of that. Now, to your comment about local control, I supported local control, but I also supported the governor's position on distraction. So I just want to be clear, because I think somehow that was lost in the process. So what I have seen is that the distraction issue, I think that has really been very successful, because students are focused in the activities that are going on. I have seen very few cases where, have we seen cases where students still have? Absolutely. I wouldn't tell you I haven't. But there's less of a focus on being on the phone, because the classrooms, with the work that's being done with the New York Inspires and the Portrait of the Graduate, is much more engaging, much more exciting. And students are seeing the applied learning opportunities of their content knowledge. So I think that at the same time, while people think of the cell phone, it's usually about, what are you substituting? What are the kinds of things that you're, how are you engaging students in terms of things that they hit the aha button or feel really connected to that learning? And what we're finding is that New York Inspires and the Portrait of the Graduate is really being a outstanding partner in creating those opportunities and creating the possibilities and having students apply that learning, whether it's in a CTE class or whether it's in a biology class that we saw, where the students are really looking at diseases and really using the Portrait of the Graduate as a way of analyzing and being critical and challenging each other and problem solving. So I think while the phone, distraction was one that the governor did tackle, the distraction has to also have a replacement. And I do believe that what we are, what we have proposed, and our districts are very excited about it, whenever we visit, that this is making a huge difference in having students focus on applied learning. So
I think the key here is, we have over 700 school districts. We've heard from very few that were any problems. So it's been a success. But now that we have their attention, we need to hold their attention. That's the key.
And that's my next question, because as I was preparing for this and talking to some people, a couple of people brought up Sweden, and I'm sure you've heard what Sweden's been working on the last couple of years, and removing tablets and some of this digital instruction and bringing back books, textbooks, buying all sorts of books. Would you ever go farther, or would you ever want to go farther in removing devices that aren't just the personal ones in a classroom?
Technology has its place, because, for example, we were in a class, I think it was in Western New York, where the students were using their technology for purposes of taking pictures of the art and designing. So I think that we have to also be cautious of what I consider to be the benefits. Sometimes we go to the extreme and lose sight of the fact that the technology, just like a medical, they use the technology to support operations and everything else. We were in a school, right, where the kids were using the technology, a cadaver, and studying the various parts of it. And so would I want to remove that from those high school students? Absolutely not. The technology has to be used with purpose, and it has to be used to inform, because our students are going to go into careers that they truly need to connect with that technology and the use of it. We were in Utica, and there was a classroom with an open corridor next door. They were using professional equipment that help them dissect and create opportunities to truly study using the technology. Technology has its place, and I think we have to be judicious in making sure that we connect the technology and what we're trying to achieve from knowledge and what I would consider to skill development for our students. Just like we use technology in ways that, you know, advance opportunities to know something, to learn, maps, you know. So the use of it has to be done with purpose. And so our schools need to really look at how do we use it to increase, to advance the knowledge base, and not just think of it as an either or. I would say use it, you know, don't use it just to you know, maintain students busy without it having purpose, but use it to enhance, to support, to create opportunities, to truly make the connections, because our students are part of a new generation that is going to continue to use the technology.
What about AI?
Oh, I think AI has its place as well. It really
Are
does.
teachers ready for, I mean, this is a tough thing if the kid's going to write a paper with that. You know, like how do you, is it that challenge?
Yeah, I think, you know, in some ways, I think we kind of take the negative part of the story and don't realize that maybe perhaps it's you know, it's an exemplar that a student could look at and write their own piece, realizing that they have an exemplar to look at. Now, teachers, you know, I do believe that AI has its, again, like the technology, has its place. How it's used and how it's misused has to be worked through in terms of our educational system. But I would not rule it out. I would make sure that we create guardrails and that we create ways of, you know, having our students understand the purpose for its use.
Real quick, Tier 6, just your position
Sure.
as a department on that. I know that's sort of a bigger, obviously goes beyond this table
Right.
right now, but what's the Department of Education stance on the
Well,
calls to fix Tier 6, as it's been said?
Well, and we don't really have much of a say, as you
Certainly.
know. I think we've had internal conversations, and I'm going to let our senior deputy respond, because
That's why he's here.
he's looked at the fiscal implication, but we do believe that it really needs to be addressed and supported.
Yeah, I think it's going to be tricky because if it's not coming out of the member, it's going to have to come from the school districts and the taxpayers. So you got to find the right balance with how much of a modification you can make. What we're in favor of is attracting people to education as a profession. And if right now the retirement system is a roadblock to that, then we need to find a way to fix that so that it doesn't become a roadblock. You know, I think we have other issues in that besides just the retirement. We need to just get people interested in the profession, get more people in the pipeline. We have other ways we're addressing that, but certainly it's worth the conversation. And you know, you can't prove how many people would come in based on the retirement system, because I don't know as every generation is thinking about retirement the day they're starting to get into a profession. But we do know when people get inside, the incentive to stay, I think, is tied to some of those benefits. And so I'm glad they're having the conversation. I don't have a perfect solution. We know you need to take it cautiously because of the expense, but we'll wait and see. We just want more people in the classroom.
Okay. Let's get to America 250. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while, and obviously I think the important way to look at it is how it's framed, right, coming out of New York State and in the Department of Education and the Parks as well. The department is also working on this.
Mm-hmm.
What's been the approach from the department in trying to celebrate this in a way that obviously reaches as many people as possible?
So I'll start by saying, as the co-chair, as you know, I have an individual on my staff who is so committed to this work. I'm sure if you saw the Regents, we won't hold it against him that he was wearing the British uniform.
Red coat.
Red coat. But he has really done an amazing job in connecting our commission and the kind of work that we're engaged in to the department.
And so the work of commemorating America's 250th anniversary really builds upon the themes that Commissioner Rosa spoke about before. How do we engage every student across New York State in the ideals of our founding generation, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And how do we commemorate not only what happened in 1776, but the struggle over the next 250 years and beyond to this very day of making sure that every New Yorker is enfranchised in those ideals? And New York really was at the epicenter not only of 1776 and Saratoga in 1777, but also throughout New York's history of the women's suffrage movement in Seneca Falls, in Seneca County, central New York, in workers' rights, the Triangle Waist Shirt Factory and the Wagner Commission. The 5-day, 40-hour work week started right here in New York, and Stonewall, giving LGBTQAI+ New Yorkers the rights of other New Yorkers as well. And so we're really implementing that using 3 strategies. The first strategy, Commissioner Rosa calls history in our backyard. And we're investing not only in our cultural institutions. There's going to be this summer a great exhibit at the New York State Museum, which is under the auspices of state education. And if your listeners haven't been to the State Museum lately, I'd highly recommend going. There's been a lot of investment in revitalizing the museum.
So I saw Barbie, yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
I was there for Barbie.
We all did.
And that unfinished revolution, we joke, but Barbie really is at the center of that. Over particularly the late 20th century, what's the women's right movement? What does that look like? And how have we seen changing ideals and cultural institutions? And so Barbie really is at the center of that. So really it is educational. And so we're working with our cultural institutions. That exhibit not only is at the State Museum, but our state museum director is working with other cultural institutions to bring this work across New York State. As you mentioned, we're working with parks and our indigenous nations to reinterpret some of those great historical markers where you're driving down the highway and some of them are not historically accurate, some of them need more explanation. We're not taking anything down, but we want to reinterpret and add to what exists. Then we're also investing in our local communities. The bulk of the money that we receive, about $1.4 million, is going right back out to local communities. So people should reach out to their county historians, their county government, to seeing what's happening in their part of New York and to help commemorate that 250th. We're doing some exciting work over the summer down in New York Harbor. They're having the Sail 250. Those tall ships are coming to New York. We're working with every single PBS station across the state to deepen and enrich the existing work that they're doing. Commissioner Rosa actually hosted award-winning documentarian Ken Burns over this fall and brought him to Saratoga and some of our school districts. And Senior Deputy Commissioner Madison had the chance to interview Ken Burns and talk about...
I tried.
He loved every minute of it. Oh my God.
Have connection with the right people.
Right.
And I would just say lastly, along those themes, to have students learn by doing, which really is at the core of New York Inspires, is we're working with WNET, Channel 13 down in New York City, to create a tapestry of New York, to have students... The quilts, yeah. Yeah, the quilt. Yeah. To have students mesh art with writing and doing, to have them see what does the revolution and that unfinished revolution mean to them, and how can they put that on to pen and paper. And we're creating a digital quilt. We actually have, our website is live, tapestryofnewyork.org, and we're doing some pilots for that project right here in the Capital Region, and students across New York will see more of that, not only this spring, but in the fall as well.
Sure. The Ken Burns dynamic, though, was interesting, especially.
Yeah.
Obviously, everything else is sort of interwoven in that, pun intended. In terms of the documentary, I think the reviews. I had people texting me that don't even live here. Did you see this?
Oh
and
my
things
God.
like that. What was the role that did the department play? It was just some conversations, or and sort of facilitating some of the background.
So
Yeah.
the New York State Education Department not only oversees K-12 education, but we also have a cultural education center. And so we oversee the State Museum, Library, and Archives. And the State Archives is an incredibly rich collection of materials, first-hand accounts of the Revolution. And so Ken Burns' team actually used the archives as a source. We also, clearly, New York is at the epicenter of the early part of the Revolution, whether it was White Plains, and actually on May 2nd, down in Yorktown Heights, there'll be a commemoration, a reenactment, bringing some of those early days of the Revolution to life, actually funded through the New York 250, Saratoga, the Battle of Brooklyn, and so a lot of those early parts of the documentary were based here in New York. And of course, I couldn't not mention our indigenous nations that Commissioner Rosa has a very strong relationship with. She actually started the first Indigenous Education Advisory Council in 2023. And so the documentary actually starts off with the voice of our indigenous communities. And the department is part of that work of uplifting and enriching the voices of all New Yorkers, including our indigenous neighbors.
And it does bring to mind some of the change. You mentioned Stonewall, and I think obviously the federal government has had some, in terms of funding and making some changes when it comes to this history. It seems like New York is very much operating independently of that, right? Is that accurate to say that despite what some of the things that we have seen from the federal government when it comes to some of these early days and maybe some of the more difficult, challenging parts of history, seems like this is a independent of what they're looking at.
We're staying pretty true to, we value history and we value giving voices and making sure that our young people in this state understand the sacrifices and the battles and the way that we have taken, our position has been that history needs to be told and the single story doesn't work. And so we want our young people to really experience it in the most authentic way. And we are staying true to our belief system. And so I'm extremely proud of this state for standing, to making sure that our young people have the true story of our country and moving it forward. We cannot, retell the story in ways that take away what really happened. And so I think collectively our mission, our department, our regions, and our commission wants to make sure that our young people really, really have an organic experience and history in a way that we all can honor what has happened and give our students an opportunity to continue to really be contributors to the next chapters in the next history. And the only way you can do that is if you really are able to see what happened and move forward and learn those lessons and really truly become civic-minded about the importance of making sure that our story is, as we often say, we the people, and us in terms of U.S., not just some.
Commissioner Rosa, Madison, Frank, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.